Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Hanlon, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of California YIMBY. Here at California YIMBY, we believe that everyone should be able to benefit from California's boundless opportunity to achieve their full potential. Our mission is to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. To further our mission, we live by three core values: neighborliness, empowerment, and excellence. The pursuit of excellence is why we're here today. California YIMBY grounds our policy advocacy in the best available social scientific evidence, and Evan Mast, an applied microeconomist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, has published some of the most relevant and exciting housing research of the past couple of years. In his 2019 paper, The Effect of New Market Rate Housing Construction on the Low-Income Housing Market, Evan showed that new housing development initiates a migration chain whereby people move from cheaper homes, often in less expensive neighborhoods, to expensive new market rate units. These moves reduce demand and prices for the previously occupied cheaper homes. Evan's most recent research finds that new market rate apartments can lower the cost of housing at the neighborhood level. In Supply Shock versus Demand Shock, the local effects of new housing in low-income areas, Evan and his colleagues from Upjohn and at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve find that new market rate construction in low-income central city neighborhoods can lower nearby rents from 5 to 7% relative to the baseline. It is my pleasure to introduce Evan Mast, and I'm excited to see what he has in store for us today. Evan, the Zoom is yours.
Great, thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And I guess I will share my screen and pull up my slides here. Okay, good to go on the slides?
Good to go.
Cool. Okay, so like Brian said, I'm going to talk about a couple of my recent papers that look at new market rate housing construction and how it affects the broader housing market. So I guess one way to start with this talk is just to note that within the economics world, and maybe even a little more broadly, I don't think this has always been such a controversial question. There was really, I think, a standard view that predominated, at least in the economics world, that if you built new construction, it was going to lower prices in the broader housing market. And the basic ideas for why that would happen, well, for one, in kind of the short run, people are going to live in those new units instead of somewhere else. And that's going to reduce demand for wherever somewhere else is. That's going to lower prices over there. And then another way of kind of expressing this in a bit of a different way is that in the long run, the new units that you build will often themselves depreciate and become cheaper and become more affordable. So those have been kind of the two standard things that people point to. But more recently, this has become more controversial, as most people on this call know. And I think there are a number of theories that are reasonable and valid that we should think about that suggest the standard view might not be the case. So one of these theories is that new construction is just not going to affect regional housing prices. And in particular, it's not going to affect housing prices in cheaper units. The theories that underlie this often kind of involve in some way the wrong people moving in or the wrong people buying the unit. So one that you'll hear a lot is that these new condos are all just going to be investment properties, and they're not going to be rented out. This is a way for stereotypically a Russian oligarch to park some money in real estate and make some money. Another thing you'll hear a lot is that if you put up a new building in San Francisco, well, it doesn't actually end up benefiting the people in San Francisco because it's just going to attract people from other cities. And you're going to pull a lot of people from Portland and Cleveland and whatever. And finally, there's this idea that basically the affordable part of the housing market and the luxury part of the housing market are separate. And what happens in one of those submarkets just doesn't matter for the other. So you can build as many luxury units as you want. It's not going to matter for affordability. The second theory that I want to highlight is a little bit stronger. It's that new housing can actually raise prices nearby. The idea here, again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but it's basically that a new building is going to change the neighborhood in some way that makes more people want to live there. So, and it's, you know, kind of one of the most basic ways you could see this is that if you put more rich people in one of these new buildings, that's going to attract some high-end amenities that are going to come and try to make money selling things to the rich people. And in turn, those amenities are going to attract more rich people, and it's going to kind of be this snowball effect. You can also imagine that some of this stuff is directly in the building, right? You could have a new apartment complex that includes a nice grocery store on the bottom, or, you know, a coffee shop or yoga place, whatever people think of as kind of kickstarting this gentrification process. And then finally, some people think that these new buildings can signal that an area is now attractive, or that it's now the hot place to be, or that it's now a safe place to go. So if all these forces are strong enough, it could be the case that a new building actually increases demand for its neighborhood by more than it increases supply. So it's going to kind of counterintuitively drive up prices, even though we added apartments to the neighborhood. So these two theories motivated a couple recent papers that I worked on along with some co-authors. I'm going to talk about both of them today. The first is going to focus on regional effects of new construction. That's going to be this migration chain concept that Brian alluded to. And the second is going to look at local effects of new construction and kind of see, you know, do they seem to kickstart this snowball effect? Do we see that big new apartment buildings accelerate gentrification if you put them in a low-income neighborhood in a city? So I'll start off with this paper on the regional effects of new housing. So the underlying research question here, as I kind of alluded to, is that, you know, we want to know how this new housing construction that's predominantly expensive is going to affect the market for cheaper housing and the broader housing market in the region. And the two established things that people think about here, one is that depreciation is going to lead these new units to eventually become affordable. And in that way, these new buildings will, over a long time period, actually add to the affordable housing stock on their own. This is often called filtering. A personal quest of mine is to change the name of this in some way, because I think filtering gets used to describe like 30 different things, and it really confuses people, including me. But I'll put it up there because I think this is like the purest way that people use it. And the second way that new housing could affect cheaper housing is through migration. And this could be a shorter run mechanism. And that's this idea of this migration chain, that when you move people into a new building, they're no longer living elsewhere, and it's going to lower prices wherever elsewhere is. So in this paper, I focus on the second mechanism. And I think the best place to start with this paper is to think about this migration chain idea in kind of a frictionless world, or in the simplest possible way. So to do that, I made a really dumb PowerPoint diagram. So let's suppose that we start off by building 100 new units. These are sort of the units that you think of when you hear about new apartments. You know, they're fancy, they're expensive, probably not everyone can afford it. So what's going to happen? Well, we'll see 100 people move in. And since these new apartments are expensive, these people probably already had some money. They probably already had, you know, a decent place. And let's just say that they're all coming from the top tier of the housing market, from already expensive units. So when those people move out, that leaves 100 vacant apartments to fill in the top tier of the housing market. So what's going to happen next? Well, someone's going to want to either sell that unit or rent it out to someone. And to do that, they'll lower prices until they attract 100 people to move up from, let's say, the middle tier of the housing market. And we'll get another 100 migrants that moved. And then, you know, this process is totally iterative, but for the sake of this dumb example, let's just say there are 3 tiers and we ultimately get 100 people moving from the bottom to the middle. So where does this example lead us? Well, for one thing, this chain of migration got 300 people to move up a tier of housing. So 300 people directly move up and get a nicer apartment than they had before. But in addition, this process should lower the rent that's charged in every tier by reducing demand, right? You moved people out of the top tier, and now you got to lower rent to fill those places. I think this is a pretty intuitive thing. I think a lot of people sort of have this concept in the back of their mind, but it really does ignore a lot of real world complications that might make this not play out as cleanly. So let's think about a couple of those. I think maybe the most important is to think about reasons that chains could end in each round. So why might a chain end? For one, a new household could form. So you build the new apartment, I'm living in my parents' basement, I move into the new place, and my parents, they're kind of enjoying the peace and quiet, they've got the basement for themselves, they don't get a new tenant. So the chain ends there because no one moves into that vacancy that I created. It's sort of similar if you think about a unit that's being used as a second home or pied a terre. If the person that buys it doesn't live in it full time, they're probably going to keep their old place, and it's not going to create another vacancy. And finally, this depends a little bit on your perspective. Are you focused on a particular city? Are you thinking about the national housing market? But if someone migrates into a new unit from another city, from the perspective of San Francisco or whoever built that new building, the chain's kind of over because it's not affecting their housing market anymore, right? So this means that the diagram maybe looks a little different when you take this into account. So instead of 100 vacancies showing up in that top tier, maybe we only get 90, and then maybe we lose 10% on every round, and we're down to only 73 people moving out of the bottom tier. This would weaken the effect of new housing on this middle and bottom tier because you're just moving fewer people out, right? So there are going to be fewer vacancies. There's going to be less need to reduce rent or lower prices to fill those vacancies. In addition, I think it's an empirical question how many tiers of the housing market there are. My simple example, there are only 3 and everyone just jumped up 1. But you could imagine that people moving into the new units are already at the very, very top. And then the people that move into their place, are from the 90th percentile. And then if this chain isn't taking a big step in every round, and you're losing 10% or whatever it might be to chains ending in each round, you might not move very many people out of the lower income places at all. And then you might say, okay, well, the segmentation theory sort of holds some water because it does seem like not that many people are moving out of a lower and middle income place because of these new units. So in this paper, I tried to directly construct this chain concept using address history data. So I've got this data, it's kind of cool, it's kind of creepy, depends on your perspective, but you can basically directly observe the addresses when someone moves. So you could imagine looking at the Postal Service mail forwarding records, right? And you could say someone started forwarding mail from address A to address B, so we infer that they made that move. And using this data, it's actually pretty easy to directly trace out this chain. So first I can, come up with a list of new buildings. I can look in my data and I can grab the people that live in those new buildings. And then I can use the data and say, where did those people used to live? I can then iterate and say, okay, well, let's look at the first round's previous addresses, who's living there now, and where did they used to live? So you can imagine doing that indefinitely. And I end up in the paper constructing about 6 rounds like that. But to start, for the purpose of this presentation, I want to just show you the first round of the chain and in just the city of Minneapolis. And I should highlight that in this paper, I'm focusing on big central city buildings. So it's sort of, inspired by debate over these bigger towers or relatively large buildings. So here is where these new multifamily buildings in Minneapolis tend to go. So this graph is all the zip codes in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. And then those red dots are the new buildings that meet this criteria of being large and in the central city in market rate. And you can see that they're concentrated in the center of the area. They're near downtown. They're largely in wealthier gentrifying areas. So the instinct that a lot of people have is, well, look at this whole big map and then look at where the red dots are. It seems unlikely that the red dots are affecting the whole thing, right? But what you can do is plot the origin locations of the people that move into those red dots. And that's what I have in this next slide. These black circles are the places that the people in the red dots moved from, where they used to live. And you start to see that, these new buildings actually ripple out and have a bigger effect over the whole metropolitan area because they draw people in. In addition, it's a little less obvious in this first round and in this graph, but these black dots are spread out through a more diverse set of zip codes than the red dots are. So there's also some evidence right away that people moving in tend to come from lower income places than where the new buildings themselves tend to go. Now, to iterate to additional rounds, you could imagine that I would throw up a bunch of green dots and I would say, okay, these are the origin locations of the people that moved into those black circles. But that gets really unwieldy and hard to do graphically, so I'm going to present that data in a different way. I'll ultimately iterate for 5 rounds and end up with this graph. Now, in this graph, the x-axis denotes what round of the migration chain you're in. So 1 is the people that moved into the new buildings. That's the black dots. 2 is the people that moved into round 1's previous locations, and so on out to round 6. And then the y-axis shows you the percent of that round that came from a below median income neighborhood. You can see that the people moving into the new buildings typically did not come from a neighborhood like that. Only about 20% of them did. In round 2, though, that goes up to about 27%. And then round 3, 30%, and ultimately up to about 40% by round 6. So at that point, you've got 40% of people in the round coming from kind of the lower 50% of neighborhood incomes. And on the whole, that round is starting to look much more representative of the metropolitan area as a whole. And I should note that this graph has 12 major cities. It doesn't just have Minneapolis. Okay, so that's really this direct construction of the chain. One problem with doing the exercise this way is it's sort of hard to give you a number. It kind of just shows, well, it seems like, this ladder thing or this chain thing does seem to work, but you have to do a little more work and put more structure on the problem to get to a number. And I won't go into the details of how that happens. It's all in the paper. I'm happy to talk about it. But basically, I use a simulation model to try to quantify the effects of all this movement. What I end up with is that 100 new market rate units lead about 45 to 70 people to move out of below median income areas, loosening the housing market in those areas. If instead of below median income, you look at bottom 20%, that number falls to about 17 to 39. It's hard to quantify how long this would take to play out exactly, but kind of back of the envelope, I think it's about 3 to 5 years. I think if anything, it's probably faster than that. And it tends to, I guess the point is that it's not, this 30-year time frame, like if you look at how long a new building itself takes to become affordable. I do want to highlight that these numbers, are a bit hard to pin down. You have to make assumptions to get these simulation models to go to get anything useful. And my approach here was kind of just to use a variety of assumptions to get a range of estimates. And that's why I'm showing you a pretty big set of numbers. Okay, so that's all I wanted to show you on the regional effects. And now I want to turn quickly to the local effects of new housing. And this paper was joint with Brian Asquith and Davin Reed. So now the question is, how does new housing affect nearby prices? As I talked about up front, there are kind of these 2 competing effects. There's what you can just call a supply effect. And that's saying that when people move into the new apartments, some of them are probably living there instead of in a nearby unit. And that's going to push prices down for those nearby units because there are going to be fewer people to bid up the prices. On the other side, there's this demand effect that the new building could make the neighborhood more attractive and it could make more people want to live nearby. That would have exactly the opposite effect. You attract more people that want to live there, you'll have more people bidding for those nearby apartments. So I think both of these effects at least in some cases, probably exist. And what we did in this paper is try to study how they balance out by using a quasi-experiment. So, very quickly, the way we did kind of two approaches. One we called a donut. So all we do here is look at the area within 250 meters of a new building, and then we compare it to the area between 250 and 600 meters of the new building. And it's basically just saying what happened right by the building, what happened a little further away. Do we see evidence that rents went up nearby relative to further away? The other thing we do is try to use variation in when exactly buildings go up. You might think that if you follow these approval processes, there's a bit of uncertainty, not only in how long it takes you to get approval and get shovels in the ground and actually build your building, but also in how long it takes for someone with a prime site to decide to sell. So what we do here is basically compare the area very close to 2015 buildings to the area very close to 2019 buildings, with the idea being that both of these neighborhoods were ultimately appealing to developers within a pretty short time frame. So we think they're probably on similar trajectories. We show in the data that seems to be true. And the 2019 building can kind of be a control group for the 2015 building. Now, I should clarify what buildings we study when we look at the effects of new buildings. And we're looking at only big market rate rental buildings, where big is over 50 units. And because this question is so kind of loaded in with the gentrification debate, where you might especially think that injecting high-income people would change a neighborhood, we focus on buildings that go up in central city neighborhoods that have income below the MSA median. So that's kind of a common cutoff for a gentrifiable or gentrifying neighborhood. Lastly, we focus on new buildings that represent the first recent large construction in their area. So they're kind of the first time that developers have made a foray into this area. And if buildings later go up nearby, that's basically counted as a part of this, pioneer buildings effect. So what do we find? Well, first we look at the effect on rents using data from Zillow. We find that after a new building goes up, nearby rents are about 5 to 7% lower than they would have been if construction hadn't occurred. And I want to note that this is based on comparison to the control groups in those quasi-experiments. So, it's either the outer ring in that donut thing, or it's the later buildings in the 2015, 2019 comparison. So we're not saying that rents went down in absolute terms. We're saying that rents in the inner ring went up by 5 to 7% less than rents in the outer ring. So I think that kind of confuses people, because you sort of say, oh, well, new buildings can help bring prices down. And they say, well, in my city where the new buildings are going up, that's exactly where rents are going up. And it's a bit of a confusing point, but it's basically saying that, things would be even worse if you hadn't built, because developers are targeting exactly those neighborhoods where prices are going up, right? And then finally, we do a little bit to try to address this problem with our rent data. Well, I don't know if it's quite a problem, but our rents come from Zillow, and they may overrepresent high-end units. So we might be looking at the effect on a particular segment of that nearby neighborhood. To try to get around that, we use that address history data that I described earlier to see how migration from low-income areas to the area near the building changes after the building goes up. So the idea here is that, okay, well, we can't exactly, be sure that we're capturing, say, the lower third of the market with our Zillow data. But if we look at the number of people moving from a quite a bit cheaper area, that should give us a sense of what happened to rents in those cheaper units. And we find similar results. The number of people moving to the area near a new building from a low-income area increases. And we think that that's kind of the best we can do to get at the question of how the new building affects rents in cheaper units that may not show up very well in our Zillow data. Okay, to wrap up, for this paper, just a couple caveats. We're studying one type of housing. It's a type of housing that adds a lot of units. It's also not a universally positive amenity. A lot of people hate these new buildings. So I think it's kind of funny that universally we hate them and think that it's going to make way more people want to live in the area. And it might be different if you studied tear downs of existing housing that were replaced with, a similar amount of units, or if you looked at duplexes that got converted to single family homes. Also, these neighborhood effects that could lead a new building to increased rents are probably really context dependent. They probably vary across locations. And some buildings probably do push a neighborhood over a tipping point. And finally, this donut isn't the perfect approach, right? So, we encourage more research on the topic to keep digging into this question because we think it's probably a rich area. Okay, so to conclude, it seems like these big new market rate buildings that we study seem like they're good for affordability, both locally and regionally. There's probably some caveats and exceptions, but in general, if you build housing and you get people to actually live in it, it should lower prices. And just to raise a couple possible questions for discussion here, happy to talk about these or not. I don't have answers to them. But I think it's interesting to ask if there has to be a tension between encouraging market rate construction and beefing up voucher and subsidy programs. I think we should think about how important are these price effects to the question of whether we want to build? Who should decide if new housing in a particular spot gets approved? There's in the discussion, there's a ton of overlap between basically housing policy and housing aims and integration policy and integration goals. And I think it's useful to talk about that overlap and how those goals can work together or against each other. And then finally, for this audience, I think it's interesting to wonder, how could YIMBYs best collaborate with planners to kind of reach the best outcome for everyone? And that's all I've got for you. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Evan. That was super interesting, and we've got a lot of really good questions from listeners. So let's dive right in. So some advocates assert that housing markets are highly segmented, as you mentioned. These advocates argue that expensive new market rate homes can only help well-to-do people who occupy the top of the market segments. These same advocates again assert that new market rate housing just cannot help low-income folks, and in fact cannot harm them. Now, your research directly challenges this view. How would you respond to those advocates?
So, I think it makes sense that people think that, because if you can't afford a building like that and you see one go up, you don't think that it's going to matter very much for you. I guess the two things I would say: one, there's sort of this idea, I don't know if it's always presented in good faith or not, but it's sort of presented as, oh, sure, because you've built this new building, someone's going to live there, instead of in this $600 a month 2-bedroom. And it's like, well, no, we're not saying directly one person's going to make that move. We're going to say the whole market's going to kind of shift. I think that's a bit of a nuance. And then the other thing, kind of for the purposes of making the research clear, I present things, as a chain of migration. But within like just a standard supply and demand economics model, this would just be a reallocation of, everyone kind of moving up, and it would look mushy and it might not show up perfectly like this chain. But the idea is eventually you have 100 people living in these new units and they're living there instead of somewhere else.
Great, thank you. Now, I just want to address market segmentation a little bit more, because it does seem to me like it could be a useful concept. So for instance, if you defined segments as school districts instead of as by income brackets within a certain a neighborhood or a metro area, then you'd find different housing prices and different demographics even in neighboring school districts. So do you think that this idea of segmentation can help us understand the operation of the housing markets in some areas?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think segments exist, and there are certainly, some segments that are more connected to each other than others. But I think there's, the connections it doesn't have to be the exact same type of unit to be connected. So like one example, when I was living in Silicon Valley, there were tons of 25 to 30-year-olds that each had a bedroom in, a 5-bedroom single family home. And they don't want that. They would much rather have their own apartment. So if you built a big new building with 1 bedrooms, you would open up some single family homes. So there's just, I think the segments exist, but there's mushiness and there's crossing of those borders.
Yeah, I mean, for 5 years, I lived with 2 other unrelated adults that we found each other on Craigslist, and we didn't like each other very much in a 3-bedroom. I really wish I could have afforded a 1-bedroom in San Francisco. Alas, that was not to be. Okay, so let's move along. Talk about your housing research enables you to answer different types of questions that earlier housing research couldn't address. So I'm thinking specifically here of how you use individual address history, which enables you to track the impacts of a home building for individual moves at the building level. This is this sort of like micro precision that some of the earlier housing researchers, like even a decade ago, just didn't have.
Yeah, I think it opens up a lot of new opportunities, and I'm excited to see what people in the field do with it in general. I think what it does is sort of, if you think about work from 15 years ago, and if someone working at the time wanted to try to assess how new market rate housing affected, below median income neighborhoods, they would probably have to try to, get a sample of metropolitan areas and like construct this kind of crude natural experiment where these metropolitan areas have looser zoning and these have tighter zoning, and let's look at how it affects median prices. And it's not that that's not useful, but it's also really useful to be able to dig into the guts and say, well, here's the theory of how this would actually happen. And with this micro data, you can actually go and kind of look at that theory in a direct way instead of having to stand at 10,000 feet and say, do we see prices and quantities move the way you would think?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so inclusionary zoning policies, for those who don't know, typically require developers to subsidize housing for low or moderate income people by including a certain percentage of homes that are affordable for those individuals in their housing development projects. Many people, including myself, are concerned that these policies worsen housing affordability by restricting home building to only where market conditions enable developers to profitably afford those subsidized homes. Not to mention, I think IZ policies are like peak neoliberalism in that it ties the provision of social welfare benefits to private market actors. But apart from that, one of your papers discusses the effect of chain migration in the context of inclusionary zoning policies. You state that, quote, a new market rate unit has a significantly bigger effect on below median income housing through market mechanisms than through inclusionary zoning requirements, generally at least 3 times as large. Could you explain what you mean by that and to help us understand how this chain migration mechanism is similar to inclusionary zoning policies?
Yeah, so there's similarities and differences. And when I'm making that 3 times as large of an effect comparison, it's basically saying, suppose you've got a typical IZ requirement of like 10 to 20%. So if you build 100 new units, you'll have to, either additionally or as part of that, have 10 to 20 be income restricted. Whereas, looking at this in my paper, I found that those 100 new units will create something like 50 to 70 vacancies in apartments that are in kind of the same income band as what we target with the income restrictions. So in that way, they're similar. But I mean, the big difference is like what those units look like, right? Because inclusionary zoning units, especially if they're on site, are going to be in a nice new fancy building. They might be nicer in a variety of ways. They might be in a higher income, more expensive neighborhood, whereas the migration chain mechanism could be anywhere in the metropolitan area and is sort of just loosening the market in neighborhoods in general. And yeah, I think it's really a balance. And that's sort of why I put this bullet on here about, what's the overlap between housing policy and integration policy? Because you have to think, if your goal was to produce as many income restricted units as possible, you wouldn't have developers put them on site ever. because it's going to be more expensive to build those 20 income restricted units in the building than it would be to build them offsite at a place where land is cheaper. So, you know, maybe for the same price, you could build 30 income restricted instead of 20 income restricted. But I mean, that's just, but I think people look at that trade and say it's worth it because you get these integration benefits from getting these lower income people in the high income neighborhood. And I think it's just this tricky overlap between, you know, a lot of areas of city planning and housing policy, and it's tough to figure out.
Yeah, one of my hobby horses is that I think that it is really an important public policy goal to bring about racial and economic inclusion, and that one way we could do that without worsening, you know, larger housing affordability is potentially to require developers to offer a certain percentage of units for long-term lease to public agencies that they in turn subsidize for low-income folks, and those units are offered at cost. I think the Central Paris region of France, this is a common policy there, is my understanding, and I think there's some other places where this is taken hold. Just like to get up with your point, I don't think there needs to be any sort of conflict between like public subsidy, especially like vouchers, right? Like more home building is going to make housing cheaper, so your voucher money actually goes further, and you can help more people. But I'll stop commenting and get back to the questions here because we have a ton of really good audience questions. So one question that came up several times, you mentioned, right, that this whole chain migration requires people actually live in these units. The question is, what impact do overseas investors buying housing have on the affordable housing market? Should we restrict the purchase of housing to American residents, citizen or not, as have some other countries like New Zealand? This question is from Susan Price-Jang.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's much more of it's interesting to me, especially because it highlights where a lot of the people that are super interested in housing affordability are from. Because, right, Billionaires Row in Manhattan, you know, this could well be a problem. You know, Vancouver, maybe it's a problem. But even if you go down to, you know, a wealthy but not world like, you know, Minneapolis or something like I put up there, I think it's much less of a problem. So it's interesting to think of it that way. But I sort of, you know, I see the benefit of letting people buy in. I mean, to some extent, if you had an unlimited supply of units and someone from outside your country was willing to buy one and pay pretty high property taxes on it indefinitely while consuming none of the services, that would be a good thing. But on the other hand, if you have a ton of people dumping money into it, that could be a bad thing. So I'm interested to see more and more results from, you know, Vancouver's vacancy tax, and as other cities do similar stuff like that, to kind of assess how big of a problem this is and what the best policies are. But yeah, I don't think I know what exactly we should do on that front.
So I got a question from another fellow economist. This is from Garrett. How do you define the length of time of a migration round? And do they add up cumulatively, or are they less than additive somehow across rounds?
Yeah, so that's why I said it's back of the envelope, and I try to go with kind of like the longer estimate, because you could imagine that a bunch of rounds happen instantaneously. You know, suppose me and three friends are all looking for, three people, they don't have to be my friends, we're all looking for a house at the same time, and a new building goes up, and I decide to go there, and, you know, I close, and then I stop bidding on the other house, and person A closes on that house the next day. You know, this could all happen kind of instantaneously because it's this reallocation of people upwards. Yeah. But what I did is just assume all of this time is additive, and then take the average amount of time that it takes a home to sell and the average amount of time that an apartment is vacant for, and say that's how long a round takes. And that's how I get to this 3 to 5 number. And that's why I think it's an upper bound, because I think sometimes it's probably happening, you know, you don't need to have someone move out and then do this whole process of waiting for someone to move in.
Great, thank you. This question is from Matt Glesney. He said that he read about another study done in, he believes, Minneapolis, that concluded that rents for lower tier units near new market rate housing went up. Are you aware of this study? And can you comment?
Yeah. So I am aware of it. There's been a few recent papers. It's great. I recommend people read them. I hope people keep writing them. So there's one on Minneapolis, and then Shouty Lee at NYU also wrote one in New York City. And all of these they're pretty similar in methodology, and they do sort of the same kind of quasi experiments that we do. With regards to the Minneapolis one and their focus on the lower income segment, I guess one thing is, we were aware of this issue, and that's why we tried to look at the migration from lower income places to try to get at it as well as we can. But for kind of nerdy data reasons, we basically can't follow the same apartment over time. So we can't do the exact same thing of cutting apartments up based on baseline rent levels that they can. And that's why they're able to do this cut that we're not able to. But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. I'd love to see more research on it. Again, I mean, an issue with this research in general is that it's going to be context dependent. And that's why I think we're just going to need a lot of studies, because we're going to have one, they just have the Minneapolis data, and I think they only have the 50+ unit buildings. So it's kind of a particular context. And I think we just kind of need to keep bringing more papers in.
Great, thank you. So one question from Marissa Tucker, which is a little bit, gets beyond just housing as housing, is that how do we prevent migration from establishing wealthier areas like a higher tax base in some communities and tax shortfalls in others? This is a concern that Pete Saunders has voiced with respect to Chicago, where you still have tons of housing development occurring in right downtown and some of the expensive coastal areas, but that he believes is in effect draining resources away from less wealthy areas in the city. In other words, it's like the inverse gentrification question, which is that it's actually making poor areas more affordable, but in so doing, reducing their tax base.
Yeah. So first of all, as a Midwesterner, thank you for referring to parts of Lake Michigan as coastal. We really appreciate it whenever you guys can do that. But
I used to live like right near Lake Michigan. It's beautiful.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think this is a really good point. There's kind of two different parts of it that I think are interesting. One, if you look at where, is a bit of a tangent, but basically there's way more people in poverty or, at kind of a relatively low income point living in the suburbs than there used to be. And I think this is really important for that tax-based question, because there you're actually going to be separated by jurisdictional borders, and it's going to be, Harvey in Chicago is not going to have the tax base that it used to when it was new builds and it was relatively high income. So I think it's really important to think about, especially when you have those town lines involved. But even within Chicago, which I think is often Pete Saunders' point, I'm not sure I've read the exact article you're talking about, the tax revenue is fungible across neighborhoods. But you have this thing of, you are kind of just concentrating wealthy people in one area. And it's sort of, I guess the tension there to me is that the opposite of that looks like gentrifying areas, right? It's saying, well, if we don't concentrate all the rich people, in the north and near west sides, they're going to spread out all over. And prices are going to go up everywhere. And then I think some people would say, well, prices won't go up that much and these places will be much nicer. And I don't have the answer to which part of that debate is right, but it's a real debate, because it would be a totally different strategy to say we're going to limit housing, but then we're going to hope this development spreads throughout, parts of Chicago that are less wealthy. I guess it's not so much of an issue in San Francisco because you've already de facto spread out wealth everywhere.
Yeah, I think, what is it? Low income for a family of four in San Francisco is, I think, now about $140,000 a year is the cutoff. It's pretty extraordinary.
Nice.
San Francisco policymaking has solved the problem of poverty by kicking out almost all their poor folks. Here's another question from Jeff. Does the treatment of housing as an investment affect housing costs? Meaning the purchase of home for a purpose other than owner occupancy, whether it's for flipping, for Airbnb, rentals, vacation homes, etc.
Yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, especially something like I guess my thought on the whole Airbnb debate is that for sure, pulling that unit off the rental market and using it as a short-term thing for people probably vacationing is gonna increase prices and reduce supply. I think the open question there, and the thing that varies a lot depending on where exactly you're looking, is how big of a problem it is. So I think I saw something that I might just mess this up, but I think it was in New Orleans French Quarter, like an area that you would expect to have a ton of Airbnbs. And there it, I think if I recall, hit like a significant chunk of the housing supply. But yeah, I think in general, the issue there is not the effect not the marginal effect of one more unit, but how many units are being used for that purpose.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So here's a question from Joy Silver. Doesn't migration doesn't migration assume that affordable housing is already available at the lower end of the pricing range for the existing demand?
I mean, to some extent, I guess if you're thinking of San Francisco and your cheapest neighborhood is already pretty expensive and you're reducing that price marginally through this migration mechanism, then it's true. That's not going to, probably bring it down to the realm of affordability, at least at the scale we build at now. Maybe if we built a ton more, it would. And I think that's where this question of, the overlap between housing policy and integration policy becomes really important. Because you might say, well, in a city like San Francisco, we can't afford, we're probably not going to be able to supply housing to a particular income level unless we income restrict it or subsidize it in some way, which I think is a fair point. I think it gets interesting, especially if you start to when I was in Palo Alto, there was a lot of question of could a teacher afford to live somewhere that was a reasonable commute? And yeah, I think those can become real problems.
Yeah. Let's see here. So here's a related question from John Geeting. How do you explain that income integration of new buildings through IZ won't have much of an effect on neighborhood level integration?
I think if you include IZ and you build 40 new units for low income people, that probably will have an effect on neighborhood level integration. I don't know if something I said indicated that I thought that wasn't the case.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question getting back to one of your discussion points. So you mentioned that there are a lot of folks who don't like new home building. We have a word for them. We call them NIMBYs. Anyone who's been to a planning commission meeting or has attended a Senate Housing Committee hearing when a contentious bill is up is well aware that new housing seems to hurt the feelings of some folks. Has anyone tried to model that, from a utilitarian perspective? Is there a certain value that you would ascribe to NIMBY tiers, and that if the benefits of housing were going to be so small, but the hurt feelings were going to be so great that we just wouldn't do it?
Yeah. So, I think it's definitely recognized that there's this tension between, a broader region could be benefited by this new housing, but the people nearby, depends which ones, but some of them are going to think, oh, this is more congested now, my parking is harder, whatever it may be. There's this new paper from Durantone and Puga that I think tackles this. Do you know this one?
No, I don't.
So I think it tries to model this basically by, I don't want to get too geeky, but it tries to basically model the growth of a city, and then as you model that, consider how residents' feelings towards growth might change. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of NIMBYism is an outcome of the model, and it kind of helps explain when things grow and don't grow. So that's what's jumping to mind. But I can't think of anything that's a direct quantification of the cost of new housing in utility terms is this.
Yeah. I've got a question. Have you seen any work coming out of institutes like your own or academic affiliate institutes that tries to predict the long-term outcome of certain housing policies. Because so in California, for instance, I see lots of analysis around proposed neighborhood plans, proposed new IZ proposals, right? Like the city of San Francisco or Los Angeles or wherever will commission an economic consultancy to try to model out the short-run impacts. But I'd be really curious to know if there's been more work on like long-term effects. One example that comes to mind in San Francisco passed a ballot initiative that required much higher rates of on-site inclusionary zoning. And they had a technical advisory committee that would set the rates. And if you read the underlying report that the consultant prepared, they arrived at the rates where they said that basically new development would pencil, and you could increase the rate of on-site inclusionary zoning by 0.5% per year, because they assume that the rental trends of the previous 15 years, where real rent appreciated about 3% each year, would continue indefinitely. And so that's like how you would afford that extra increment. Well, if you do that math out, then you're left with a one bedroom in San Francisco costing $5,500 a month in real non-inflation adjusted dollars. And I see so little of that type of work, because I'm concerned that a lot of cities are on this sort of trajectory towards mass unaffordability that would seem unreal right now. And it's just like not broadly known and taken into account in current policy debates.
That's a really interesting point. I think the short answer is that there is not a lot of work on that, partially because it's just hard to look over a long run, especially housing data hasn't been very good for very long. It's been worse than like individual income data or something like that. I think it would be super valuable. Especially for something like that where, you're trying to plan for 30 years or something, and you should probably build recessions into that plan or something, right?
Yeah. So you, in areas of further discussion, noted, is there a tension between market reconstruction and beefing up voucher and subsidy programs? And I suggested that I don't think that there is a tension between those things. But I am curious. Do you have a preference for a certain type of housing subsidy program, given that it is very clear that in many high-cost areas and indeed low-cost areas, tons of Americans simply cannot afford safe, secure, adequate housing? So, like, what do you think are the best ways to help folks afford the housing that they need?
I think it's a crucial question. My thought is probably that we do need to expand vouchers and subsidies in those areas substantially and make it easier and less complicated to get and use them. I don't know. I'm not quite an expert on exactly what that would look like. I haven't dug into the housing choice voucher program. I don't know all the details, but I think that certainly expanding and making it easier to use would be great. The thing I'll say that relates directly to this tension between construction and voucher or subsidy programs is that I think there's really an opportunity there, and some cities do it, to basically sell developers zoning and get vouchers, get subsidy units, get donations to different things in return. I think inclusionary zoning requirements that looked like that could have a very different effect, where you said, for every additional, whatever, if you imagine something that could realistically happen, you could say that San Francisco says, we're going to put our IZ threshold at 20%, and then we're going to say, you can build 50% more than the zoning currently allows, but you have to reserve half, or something like that, something that basically aligns the incentives. And I think that would be a good thing for cities to explore more.
Thank you. One other question that you suggested for further discussion is, who should decide where housing should be approved? And so this to me is a real little d democracy problem, where city councils, right, decide where housing goes, where to approve it. And yet these city councils these cities are embedded in a much larger labor market. And so if you just take the Bay Area, which I'm most familiar with, you have about 101 cities in the 9-county Bay Area. And so while cities like Cupertino or Palo Alto, which are with a median home price of about $3 million, may say no more housing, but we'll take all the tax revenue from the high wage jobs. That then causes displacement in East Oakland. It then causes increased commute time where people are driving from the Central Valley, and yet the folks impacted have no voice there. But we don't have regional governance. We have state governance, right, which is like where California YIMBY focuses much of its efforts. Like, do you have any thoughts about like the appropriate level of housing decision making?
I don't know exactly what the answer is. It seems like the current model is that the residents within a quarter mile get the most say, and the longer you've lived in the neighborhood, the more say you have. And that doesn't seem very sensible to me. I don't know. I mean, I would be curious to hear, people who are on the ground at these meetings all the time, what's an alternative model that you think has, a chance of happening? Maybe it's like county minimum standards on zoning, and the towns can kind of negotiate on that. That's sort of what it looked like in Oregon, right? But yeah, I totally agree. There needs to be some kind of just regional governance in some form. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but it would be great to move towards that.
All right. Well, on that note, Evan, we are almost out of time here. And I really want to thank you for your time. This was super interesting, and I learned a lot, and I read this stuff all the time. Before I give the final close, is there anything that you wanted to address real quick?
Not particularly. Thanks for having me on. It was interesting to hear people's questions.
All right, thank you so much. Now, while the work of scholars like Evan is critical to helping policy advocates like California YIMBY formulate our advocacy agenda, fortunately, economists do not rule the world. If you support evidence-based housing policy, please join California YIMBY if you're not already a member, and get involved with your local YIMBY group. Please check out our website at cayimby.org/action-hub, action-hub, where you can volunteer, contact your local elected officials to support legislation, register for more educational webinars, and donate to support our work. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great week.
Thank you all for joining us. This event has been recorded and will be available from cayimby.org/events in the coming days. We hope you've had a great time, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.